Welcome to the Rooted in Washington podcast, a podcast about family engagement from Roots of Inclusion. I'm Carrie Bossis, the host, and today my guest is Sarah R.V. Tove.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Should I do more?
No, it's totally fine. I mean, if your mom or anybody else is listening, it's really important. We want a sense of welcome as we talk about family engagement. So we do go way back when you were a relatively new graduate student and we were working on the Disability History and Pride project. And I found you through a friend. You find all the best things on the internet, my husband pointed out. Yeah. But now you're a professor, a researcher, and a new mom. I mean, I almost gave you your dissertation defense, but your kids were very intent on coming and causing some chaos on their own schedule. So can you share a little bit about your journey to where we are now? Because I haven't seen you in a bit.
Yeah. The dissertation defense situation was funny. I almost posted up with all this artwork, all the student artwork they'd created from a hospital bed behind me. But luckily I got to go home right beforehand. So I got a nice little 45-minute nap before I got to defend. But I cite you regularly in personal and professional settings as one of my greatest intros to disability, community, and culture. And literally a lot of my work is around relationality, is around disability, identity, community, and culture. And so to kind of pay homage to all the people in my life who have made that possible for me is really central to my work. And so, I was already interested in disability identity affirming work. That's how we got connected, was my thoughts and desire to create curriculum around that. But what amazed me in that project was the power of intergenerational disability community, connecting with you and Clark and learning about your all's movements in disability rights and disability justice, and then all the resources you were able to pass on to me, and then connecting with Adina, who is a fellow educator and organizer of sorts, and then also with the youth and hearing the youth talk about their identities and the impact of our work on their sense of disability community and culture really transformed my whole graduate program. And so, that's what really brought me to my project, which we'll talk about a little later. But yeah, the idea of bringing together intergenerational disabled folks, especially thinking about our identities, and multiply marginalized folks and the ways that our intersectional experiences play into our commitments to disability justice in schools was just really powerful. So I hope you know I genuinely cite you regularly, even just in writing. I'm like, Carrie Bassa hooked me up with this amazing opportunity.
It was really lovely. It was the best part of my job at that time. And just finding you all, and we found ways to work together for years. And I still tell people that the students who are part of the project and sharing their own stories about what inclusion meant to them felt like we were really old. I wanted to know why Clark was only in his 30s, I believe, at the time. This old man was following them around in school like there was a predator vibe. But I just thought, okay, this is humbling. This is who we are, however we feel in our hearts. And then co-presenting, and then just doing a poster of Anita Cameron and thinking about our disability elders and all that meant, finding space for community. And then through COVID, and we kept going, and to the point where the ombuds office got really tired and said, okay, everything's going to live in a Google Drive on the website. That's what you get.
Yeah, the amount of care and attentiveness to access also really shaped the way that we were just talking about the ways that I think about coursework, I think about being in educational spaces or being with community and really attending to that care. Because I know that's one of the things that kept me coming back to 105 is I love that project. And I show up in a variety of spaces who tell me they still use 1 out of 5 all the time, that it's really one of the only resources available that really centers disabled youth and really authentically came from like a 4S bias model. So anyhow.
Another state called, and I know they talked to you too, and it was so funny because they were asking the questions you would ask to do a budget proposal for legislation, and then to have, some sort of task force or something. And I said, no, we just decided that something was good and we started making it. And yes, for sustainability and to pay people at a better rate, like it would have been nice. It would have been nice to have staff built in to track a project or to market it and keep it going and to be paid to deliver it. I help teachers understand how to use a disability history and pride learning resource, but we didn't have all of those logistics. You could still do it without legislative authority or a task force or a committee that meets for years.
Yeah, even as you're saying that, it almost makes me think more about when we discuss some like loving critiques of disability rights versus disability justice. And really, the 1 out of 5 disability history and project came out of that disability justice framework, that it wasn't, you were working for the Office of Education Ombuds, but it was really community-based, rooted in rights and disabled educators and disabled youth coming together out of care and a desire for transformation that we want to see in our schools. And so we didn't have a task force but it took off anyway. I mean, we also didn't necessarily, we had a follow-up research project that was really helpful and amazing. I think people wanted this though, and if they didn't, then when they saw it, they realized they wanted it.
They realized they needed it.
Oh, yeah, because there was a huge gap, exactly, a huge gap in most spaces.
Well, it is interesting. I'm doing another project with students now, and it's through my consulting work. And I had to verify that the students were actually people because a lot of them applied for it, and I just wanted to meet them. But it wasn't an official interview. I didn't want to freak them out. And if they were minors, their parents needed to be there because, again, I was like, just everything by the book. So one of the parents that joined the call was talking about how when her family, her kids are excluded because of disability, the rest of the family is excluded. And that kind of sat with me too, because they're all having that experience. And now you've become a parent. And I guess I'm thinking about what is the best part of being a new parent, or, depending on the day, really the most challenging parts of being a new parent, because it's so tiring.
There is definitely a lot, and there's a lot of beauty, and there's a lot of, learning curves, but not to be cliche, but their smiles and their laughs. I have twins, that's why I keep saying they just warm up my heart and soul in the room, especially in these very kind of challenging sociopolitical moments. And really the other thing that I just love is watching them learn, like watching their cogs and watching them try something new, realizing that hitting a ball makes it move, noticing and looking outside and watching, is just really cool. And, since we have 2 babies, watching them learn together, but then also the different strategies that they use to get something done. And so watching that individuality develop alongside that kind of special connection or partnership in community, right? Even in family, we're in community. And so it's really powerful watching. It's also like watching them learn to share, but then also watching them already get into some conflicts over who gets what and when. And as a parent being like, okay, when does this look like sharing? And when is it time to be like, actually, Zayit was using that, or actually Simi was.
Yeah.
Like,
Oh, we're doing self-advocacy training.
yeah, exactly.
It can be pre-verbal. It's cool. It's
Absolutely.
fine. You went into academia. You had been a teacher and you've been a community organizer and you're a disabled professor and researcher, and now you're a parent. And so how has your perspective on disability identity and education changed over time?
I mean, really, when I was a middle school teacher, I was told not to disclose my disability. I was told, not to talk to students about it, not to even, I had to talk, I had a few circumstances where I needed particular accommodations. So I talked to my admin about it, and even that got a little challenging at times. And it wasn't until I acquired another disability, and that was right before graduate school, that I really had to think a little more deeply about what it meant for me as a learner and then later as a professor. And again, like 1 out of 5 absolutely informed that process, because I was doing some of the like personal identity work or thinking through what my multiple disabilities meant for me in educational and personal spaces. But then being connected to community really transformed my sense of self and connection to disability identity as well. And then even more than that, connection then to disability culture. And so in my mind, I now can't talk about one without another. Like when I talk about disability identity, I'm inevitably talking about community and culture. When I talk about disability community, I'm thinking about the ways that it interacts with identity and culture. And so really cultivating those across personal and professional spaces has been really, essential and central to me. And then also taking into account the intersectional experiences of disability, identity, community, and culture, right? Like while connecting in all these ways, recognizing, take some disability justice principles, but really recognizing intersectionality and recognizing wholeness in that. And so relating to one another in those disabled spaces while also knowing our distinct and intersectional experiences inform what that means to us and different disability communities, right? That is also not a monolith. Disability identity is not a monolith. Even disability culture is not a monolith. But, and then, in our home now, I really think about what disability justice means in our everyday actions, what it means in our family values, and what it is to model that.
I mean, that's a beautiful way for somebody to grow up, too. A lot of people with disabilities who have had disabilities since birth or since they were little don't necessarily have that. And going back to the 1 out of 5 project, which if people aren't familiar with, we came together across experiences and made this disability history and pride learning resource, which came with slides and student videos, and really was like who we saw as a just add water approach. The legislature had required the schools teach about disability. We didn't think it was really happening, and we wanted that to be disability led. And some of the resistance that we had gotten was people saying they didn't feel like they had the capacity. And then when we asked, what does capacity mean? It wasn't really time, or it wasn't that we missed making something for them or you making something for them and you're offering training and support. But it kind of links back to your earlier comment about when you were a teacher being told not necessarily to share your disability. And then we found that students were more receptive, willing to share their disabilities than the adults in the buildings. So it was always their secret mission was to get the adults feeling more comfortable. But to be a teacher and be told, maybe you don't want to share that.
Well, and now, I mean, in my higher ed courses, and then also when I'm working with youth, I now choose to disclose either my specific disabilities or that I'm disabled and, refer to myself as such. It's incredible, the responses, the positive responses, right? Like disabled youth I find feel more I mean, that's one of the things that came up even in some of my research projects was when I was talking to youth, they were like, it felt good knowing that I had a disabled teacher.
Yeah.
Like it felt, when I heard some of the stories you were telling, I could relate to them as another disabled person. And so really having those shared stories and shared spaces, and also shared stories, not just of ableism, right?
Yeah.
But like talking about ableism in our schools and in society, but also connecting over stories of, like I was just saying, of learning about disability community. And they're like, oh my gosh, I didn't know about disability community. Oh, now we're in disability community. They got jazzed. Like it was a really, and then even thinking through, and I think about this with 1 out of 5 too, when we're in really ableist spaces, access needs are considered huge barriers. And I find that when I'm in disabled spaces, they become opportunities for creativity.
Yeah.
And so it's like, how are we navigating potentially access tensions, like where one person has an access need that conflicts with another person's access need, right? How are we in community around that? How are we creative around that? What does that mean to be genuinely committed to collective access? And so it's cool to be working through those things. And then, especially in spaces with disabled youth, talk about those and what that means.
And there's creativity in community, and it's not to be saccharine about it. It's just because people have had to figure it out in a world that's pretty hostile to how their minds and their bodies function. And so, I don't know, I've always found a lot of grace in community. I wish we had better welcome packets as a community, and I do think it's cool to be a disabled parent. It's also hard. But yeah, I didn't grow up with any sense of disability identity from my parents. When I started to come into any sort of sense of identity or community, they said, but you've done so well. Like, you're not like that. You're not like them. And I said, this is a whole part of me that I've missed, and it's part of my experience every day. Know what you think I matriculated from having a disability. I still have a disability. And I find with friends who are really great allies and accomplices that are like working in disability space, just even the way their kids who are young will share things like about access features. Like I said, oh, how was Meow Wolf? And 7 will like, well, let me tell you about like the sensory load. Am I talking to a 10 or 11-year-old? Like, what? Did you get some sort of docent ADA compliance? I was like, this is well beyond. And I didn't even ask that. I asked I'm half here as the parent. How was that experience that you had? And they point out what works and what doesn't. And I just thought, that is really reassuring to me that you see the world in this way. Like, good job, parent friend who has been having the conversations with their kids. And it also makes more space if those kids later identify as having disabilities to not feel like that's a forbidden conversation in their family.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And not to feel stigmatized or essentialized, right? That there's not a single experience of disability either. And so
how do you see, because the podcast is about family engagement, but the role of family engagement in shaping disability identity?
I've been really struck by the importance of having really authentic and candid conversations. And so my babies qualified for services because they were premature. And when we were learning about the different like potential organizations or service providers, I really wanted to ask about what their perspectives on disability were, how they viewed development, just around thinking through and then sharing my experience with disability and also some of my work on disability. So also coming from it like, well, here's my perspective and what does that kind of mean to you? And so I think really engaging in those conversations, and one of the things that's come up in my work and, our work that we've talked about too is sometimes educators' reluctance to engage in conversations about disability, either because they haven't thought about it or they have kind of a taken for granted or common sense notion of disability that doesn't necessarily match. And so even though the babies aren't classified with disabilities, just still looking for services grounded in care and wholeness and not behaviorism. For me, when I think about the role of family engagement now, I really am thinking about like as a service provider, as a teacher, as whatever your role may be, when you're engaging families, being very clear and open about what stance you're taking to, right? Just be really candid. And I think about that, and so not just the like, oh, well, we're committed to education or services for all. So, right, you come across this in race, you come across it for queer students, right? Well, we're welcoming to all. And it's like, but what does that actually mean to you?
Yeah.
Like,
What does it mean? And then people getting nervous
Yeah.
into like, well, if you're asking me, is that quote normal for a child? Are you asking me to make a diagnosis? Are you asking me to do something different? I know that when we had early learning environments that were accessible or inclusive years ago, we could find something that was like 4 hours a day somewhere through the district, and then like 3 to 4 hours in our neighborhood. And we were patching it together. And the neighborhood-based one had an ironic name for how I felt when you first read it, but I won't go ahead. But I just like cringe because the marketing was there about how we include everybody.
Yeah, exactly.
And I feel like, at a personal level, there was that sentiment. But we had a breakdown early on where they said, we'd like your daughter to explain to the other students what's going on with her disability. And one, we had just adopted her from Ukraine. So we didn't really have a lot of shared language, period. Was this supposed to be in Russian, Ukrainian, English, a mix? Were we now teaching preschoolers, are we having an interpreter? I have no idea. And why? Because she's okay. Like, is there something here, like when you're sharing the scissors or the glue? Is there something functional where somebody needs context? And why does she have to come with some sort of speech or disability awareness training for children? And they said, well, you could say something. And I said, I'm not going to tell her story for her.
Yeah.
I don't want to be, here, great early childhood memory. My mom came in and decided that this was my story about why I don't speak English and why my arms are different and why I move differently. And in what world? I understand you want to build a community, but if there's a story that she wants to share, when she's able to, she will. And until then, is there something else I can help you with? Because I can't do that. I don't even fully know her story. I don't like, what is she going to say? Was we doing a TED Talk in preschool?
No, yeah. And it's wild too, interesting to think about like who's actually uncomfortable in that situation.
Yeah.
Like, were the kids talking about it and they wanted some sort of, or were the adults uncomfortable and wondering how to talk about disability in that space? And so that also, and I ask even my, teacher candidates now, like, really think about like the moves you're making and when it's something that's making you uncomfortable. And then do your work, do your homework, think about, not homework for me, but I mean like generally like, go out there and learn. Don't make moves based on you being uncomfortable.
Yes. And requiring someone else to change that for you, explain that for you, make a slide deck around it.
Yeah.
But seeing how far you can go with changing what your sources of information are, or just being vulnerable and trying to talk to other people and ask them, what do you do with this? Because I feel like I'm not showing up well or I'm incompetent and I hate that.
Yeah. And people are like, I run into it a little less now, but still like afraid to even say the word disability. Or, when I'm like, I use identity first language. They're like really nervous about when and how to like say disabled. And that, part of that is like, okay, I understand that. And I'm not trying to push you like wildly out, but also like it's nice to see as people become more comfortable because at least in my courses or my spaces, if someone uses a euphemism, I'm like, you can just say disability. Like, unless someone identifies with a different term, like, there's nothing wrong with a disability. And so
Yeah.
why are you shying away from using that word?
Yeah. It's often just a move to protect themselves, to not put themselves out there too much, to sometimes differentiate. Like, I'm not like that because they have maybe negative perceptions about disability. And I know some people just don't want to take up space too. A lot of people will share, well, I have X, Y, and Z. And I say, well, under many federal and state laws, you're disabled. Congrats. Like, again, there's no balloon drop, confetti, no fun mailer that comes your way. I said, you have a disability. And they say, well, I don't really want to talk about it because, like, I'm not disabled like you because it's more visible. And then I, like, just, okay. I didn't ask that from you.
Yeah.
I would love it if more people were claiming it because then we would broaden our idea of what disability was, which is really cross disability and affects so many people. But I understand too that we're not in a society in which you feel like there's a lot of benefit or you're still exploring your identity. But it wasn't because you weren't, quote, like somebody else sent you a letter saying you weren't, quote, disabled enough or in a traditional way that you couldn't share it. That's something you're telling yourself. Yeah, I don't want you to like become an inspirational speaker and tell everybody they should be using the word special needs. Like, I do want to contain some of that. Like, you maybe need an orientation, but so far so good. I think we can send you forth in the world, but there's a lot of talk in people's heads about disability. And we also put a lot of focus on disability as something happening to children or like very old people. And then that's just aging. And so it's weird to be in this space of disabled and a parent too. Yeah. And I guess what do we do? We're some ways the schools and educators, when they think about disabled parents, maybe it's not all that different than how we show up for, disabled infants, but can we support them better with engagement?
Yeah, I was thinking about, one of the first things is access.
Yeah.
And I don't mean access just in terms of like setting up a ramp, which is some people say. They're like, well, but we did this one thing.
People love to give me tours of their ramps. And usually they're so long that I'm going to go up the stairs, but thank you. And I'm not so sure about that.
And if it's a ramp in front of the building instead of in the back.
Oh, yeah, it's not a dumpster. Yeah. I've done the dumpster door ramp.
But, really thinking about access as creating spaces where it's even having on a flyer something like the access needs that will be in the space. Like, we're going to have closed captioning. We're going to have maybe a sensory break room. We're going to have and being honest too, like, we're not going to have, unfortunately, we don't have funds for a sign language interpreter. However, if you need that, please let us know and we can find that, So also recognizing when they know there are barriers. Because also often it's known when there are barriers, but those also are not explicitly stated. And so I think making those moves is helpful when thinking about access, both kind of what's there and then also thinking about, I think there's barrier in general in schools where it's not recognized that many people have no reason to trust schools. And that, again, comes from a very intersectional lens as well. Like, schools were built thinking of white, non-disabled, affluent folks. And so there's a lot of barriers built in to schools. And so I think also attending to those and knowing that you got to step it up. That really when you're talking about access or when you're talking about a sense of belonging or when you're talking about family engagement, that it's really grounded. And again, in that authenticity and community and care, that we don't just want you here so that we can say that we engaged families, which is also what I feel like happens sometimes.
Oh, yeah.
Like, oh, there was a parent at the table. That's great. Okay, check off that box. Even if we didn't actually use any of their feedback or respond, like, oh, we got it done. And then I also think about, for me, since it's thinking about disabled parenthood in relation to family engagement in schools, that I didn't have an IEP in school. And so that's also really different. It's still a different experience coming in as, I was a disabled educator, and now I'm a disabled professor, but I didn't have that childhood experience of feeling isolated because I had an IEP. I watched friends go through that, and so I can relate to it in that way or empathize with it in that way. And I listen to students talk about it, but it's still different from having gone through it myself. And so I think about that too. I don't know how that fits into family engagement in particular, but it is something that I think about when I'm thinking about my disability and disability in schools, the things that I can and cannot relate to on kind of deeper levels.
Well, that's important for educators to understand too,
Mm-hmm.
and the issues that they'll see and naturally respond to, and others that haven't been part of their experience that they just might miss. I mean, if a student is not feeling included in school because of disability or another identity, it's highly unlikely that the parent will. Although I have seen the flip happen where if school is not going well for a student, and if a parent has the capacity, which is a tremendous privilege, I think come at great cost to a family too. But the family sometimes feels like it has no choice but to be a more consistent presence in the building by volunteering or doing something else just to get eyes on the situation. And the level at which I've seen families, if they can do something like that and get the permission to go in to find out and to make things better or make a student or group of students feel supported, is an incredible sacrifice. It's also usually out of a lot of desperation for something to be better. And then going back to like just sharing access to information, I think just providing more information to people, not necessarily in paragraph form but people they often don't know what their access needs would be, even if it's a disability or not. Where is the event happening?
Yeah.
What is transportation like to the school? Is the parking lot open? Does the bus run at that time? Are we coming to a dinner time meeting and there's no food?
Yeah.
All of the things where you signal to people, I have thought about you. And if there's something beyond the baseline of what I've thought about, here's a process for asking for like ASL interpretation. And I need a week or two to set that up. But I, there's some things I automatically build in knowing my school population and the needs right now. And I book those. And if there are other things, I can add them.
Yeah.
But I need a heads up. But people don't know to give a heads up if they're not sure. Will there be a microphone? People just going to be talking from cafeteria tables about what their concerns of their students are going to be. Is there an interpreter? Is everything in English?
Yeah.
What is this thing I've signed up to do?
Yeah. No, I think that's really important. I appreciate you pointing out too, because it's often how I talk about and think about access as well, is that it's not solely in relation to disability, that there's so many other points of access. And then I also was thinking, as you were talking about different assumptions that might be made around families, or families specifically of students with disabilities or families with disabled parents, is also a question that I feel like I often get is like, well, what do you do if a parent cultural background has negative associations with disability? I don't want to discount when there are, disabilities absolutely sociocultural, political, and to assume that a family because of their cultural background, has a specific stigma or perception of disability is wildly, I mean, I'd even say like inappropriate. Like
Yeah.
and I've seen and heard that happen quite a bit. And then people be surprised, like, oh, you support your disabled student. And it's like, why did you immediately assume that they wouldn't? And on the flip side, even like, oh, you come from this other background, I assume you will support them. And it's like, oh, wait, you also have a negative. Anyway.
Yeah, in some ways, people can hide behind that. I mean, it's
Yeah.
important to be culturally responsive and understand to make an assumption because a family is living through a certain experience doesn't mean that they are a National Geographic magazine about this thing, and it's highly nuanced. And then to expect that there's not tension for families who would identify as being white and mainstream or a certain set of resources in how they look at disability, which can sometimes not be positive when it comes to their own child, just shows that people need access to information about what it's like to live with a disability. They need to know they're humans with disabilities and decide where they are in their identity and what, community and resources they might need as they're exploring that.
Yeah.
It's hard because I think a lot of the information people get, it's through school and through assessments, but it starts even before that with doctors and waiting long time for certain kinds of evaluations and only being explained what's, quote, wrong with someone.
Yeah.
And then having to process that. Or maybe, there are many family support groups out there, some of whom are very focused on cultural identity and language. But it's hard to know sometimes how many people with disabilities who are adults in that culture are part of that or sharing their experience and how much people end up, challenging assumptions that are made. Sometimes there's bad information.
Yeah. No, and it also, as you're talking, makes me think about that. And I think about this in family engagement, particularly in like special education evaluations and IEP meetings, that potentially ironically, special education has some of the least accessible language and processes. And so it can be really challenging to come into a meeting and all these acronyms are being thrown around and all of these test names are being thrown around and many of which are very deficit based. And so, and there is, attempting to now be shifts in the ways that we talk about evaluations and IEPs. But I, at times, had parents crying in IEP meetings, either because the amount of information was overwhelming or the way that it was presented was such a deficit, particularly around, say, IQ test scores, which then I'd have to be like, no shade to the school psych, but, she'd present an IQ test score, and then I often would be like, I just want to also preface with the IQ test is very known to be racist and ableist. And so that's a number that is used in special education, that's used in a lot of spaces talking about disability. And let's not get hung up on that.
Yeah. It's not dictating a particular feature, making a statement about the capacity and capabilities of your student. And then you figure you have those processes are set up. We're focusing on the student with a disability, a parent with a disability engaging in those processes. Too, is just another barrier that's not really anticipated.
Yeah.
And it's hard sometimes to know what you're going to need for support in those formal processes until you've been through them.
Yeah.
So it just kind of compounds because if it takes a while to process information, now you're at this thing where somebody's trying to combine this 30-page document they want to read aloud to you with let's make some goals, let's do it all in an hour, maybe 90 minutes for being generous and be finished. And of course, we can always meet again, but, let's hope in a year. and let's check it off because we have more things in the pipeline. We need to get this finished.
Yeah. No, it's a lot. And like you're saying, it's like a lot to process. And then also, you know, as a disabled parent, it can also be triggering if they're talking about disability in a particular way, or, and really it's not just, they're talking also about your kid.
Yeah.
Like, it's not just, not that I'd want them talking about any kid in such a deficit manner, but, and then if it's either a shared disability or even a different disability and you're hearing all of this stuff, it's really weighing. Like I said, there have been lots of moves and attempts to shift this, and I've seen, a lot of incredible work around student-led IEPs and around genuine family engagement in the IEP process. And, now there's some culturally relevant and responsive builder IEP tools, but I'd argue that that's still not common practices yet. So I never want to make it sound like it's totally stagnant or anything. There's attempts or people moving in that direction, but
I think it's being responsive to what's in front of you too, right? It is your child. I've noticed how things have shifted being a parent, having a child who has an IEP, who just got reevaluated, and they wanted to do a meeting agenda, which kind of felt neutral to them. And there was a significant amount of time reviewing the results of the evaluation and telling us all the positive things about our child. Well, given the data that we got, that is not where I want to be. I know my child, love my child. This person who was coming, who was a school psych on contract, didn't really know my child. I knew the school team.
Yeah.
We had just seen them a couple of months ago. Like, I don't doubt that they see positive things about her. I did not understand some of the scores. And then the recommendation that was coming out of the scores seemed to be in contrast to what the data telling me. But they were like, could we just start there? No, I don't.
Yeah.
I know that this is supposed to be leading with, student-centered, but we don't have a lot of time together because now we tried to get all of these people, plus Gen Ed, plus the outside expert, plus the people who are providing related services all in one call. And we should be able to give you feedback. We've read the thing.
Yeah.
We should be able to give you feedback on where we feel like we need to spend time. We don't have any questions about that the thing was finished and what tools you used. But this is where, if we don't spend the bulk of the time, we're not going to have any resolution from this meeting. And I am worried that I'm failing my child if I just go along with the recommendation. So those are your barriers. Like, at least I could say them. But it was very, but we have this agenda and this is what we're supposed to be doing. Well, that agenda is not really working for me.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, I think that goes back to this idea that, like, oh, family engagement is this one thing, or if you're at the table. But if you're at the table and we're just telling you what we're going to do, that's not engagement. That's not community. That's not relationship. And I don't know if this happened to you, but I've seen it happen in other schools or in other IEP meetings or with other families, that also if a family is like, no, I don't actually want to go along with this, I actually have a different perspective, they become kind of like a problem family.
Yeah.
That then, oh, well, they're making things hard, that we have this plan. And then, and then obviously that's not genuine engagement. Now you've created a situation where you're pitted against a family. And that doesn't make sense to me at all.
Yeah, you can certainly end up feeling as a parent, or I'm sure it happens for educators too, that you're playing a highly stereotyped role.
Mm-hmm.
And there are the gender dynamics of that. Mm-hmm. I've even said to my husband, like, I need you to get in there so I'm not the hysterical mom. I mean, I'm not, and he had similar fears, but because I went first and who I am, then there was a reaction to that. And even if your meetings with a bunch of other women, and so it just, and I know that there's a really hard conversations have, and people don't necessarily feel seen and respected because parents can be coming in hot, educators can be coming in and a lot of professional language and shutting things down. All of the legal framework around it makes you feel like you can't necessarily be vulnerable because you don't want to admit that there's maybe a gray area or something you wish you could do that you don't feel supported to do, or something you would try but you're not sure it's going to work, and it doesn't bring forth people's best thinking.
Yeah.
Or their best selves.
Yeah. That's a lot.
It is a lot. How is that as a teacher, though, being in the mix?
Yeah, I mean, I when families and case managers were having some challenges of communication, I was often, well, I was, obviously a special ed teacher, and then in my last couple of years, I was also our department head, and I tended to really engage, ask what they wanted, ask what we needed, and helping families feel heard and seen, and then also checking in with students. And so I think, like I said, I also tend to point out that many of the assessments are very skewed and very problematic. So I think that also before that, this might be a slight tangent, but even before, an IEP meeting should not be the only time that you're asking parents about what's happening for them, what's happening for their kids. So, already, if that's the only time you're meeting with them, you're going to run into some issues. So, also, just really thinking about how you're building those relationships from day one. Like, how are you going about this? It's not every teacher's favorite thing, even if I think it's an absolutely critical component of teaching, is creating. People talk about classroom communities and the importance of classroom community, but if families are left out of that community, that's, in my mind, it's not a full picture of what that means. And then bringing that into conversations about IEPs, bringing that into conversations about disability, bringing that into conversations about whatever may be happening in schools. And again, that's not to toot my own horn. I've had plenty of, humbling experiences as well, but also even in those moments, taking accountability, being like, hey, I approach this in a certain way and I'd like to shift or turn it, or my apologies, whatever repair needs to be done to remain in community, to remain accountable to the people we care for. And I think we care for our kids and we care for their families and schools. So,
well, certainly it makes it easier to do that if you, like you're saying, have some sort of relationship or connection beforehand, because then it feels more real than we're supposed to go through this format of appreciation. Then we get into some data and testing, and then we decide some goals and we'll email them to you next. Just shifting in the last few minutes of thinking about your work is focusing on cripping culturally sustaining pedagogy. And what does that mean? And then how does that connect with family and community engagement?
Yeah, so cripping culturally sustaining pedagogies builds on Django Paris's work of culturally sustaining pedagogies, which have been approached from kind of racial, ethnic, and linguistic practices and how we're sustaining those in schools, and particularly ways of knowing and being, and not just honoring, not just being relevant, but genuinely seeking to sustain them in educational practices. And so cripping culturally sustaining pedagogies is like a centering and celebrating and sustaining of disability identity, community culture in schools. So very much so around, as I was sharing, thinking about shared experiences in disability community, honoring disabled experiences, expansive communication techniques. So thinking about all the different ways that disabled folks communicate, thinking through the importance of, and, as we were talking about earlier, in many cases, even introducing the conversation around disability, identity, community, and culture in school. So even just introducing that for many students is incredibly impactful. And so then also to be creating spaces where you're seeking to sustain disabled ways of knowing and being is really, really powerful. And so that's where my work has gone. And then I think about that. I think about, cripping CSP in my own life. I mean, going all the way back to the 1 out of 5 disability history and pride project, I'm like, that was like cripping CSP to me, being able to be in a space where disabled stories were honored, where we were working with one another in ways that were accessible, not just access as a value, but access as a genuine practice. And I, maintain that again. Much of my work is relational. And so I actually had a hard time in my dissertation at times being like, I can't take sole authorship for a lot of these things because they're in relationship with so many people. None of these ideas are like solely mine. I would never want to. Anyway. But yeah, and so then I was thinking about how it intersects with family and community engagement. And I really think that inviting families into that is really crucial. And again, not only for disabled families, but also just thinking about if and how disabled ways of knowing and being are taken seriously in schools and honored in schools and sustained in schools. So not asking students or their families to mask, not asking that students and their families always be moving towards, well, we want your kid to be seen as, quote, normal. But again, honoring and sustaining and practicing access and disabled ways of knowing and being.
How do we help educators then dismantle racism and ableism? Easy question.
I was just going to say,
so light.
Lickety split. I mean, I think one of the biggest things is to like transform the frameworks we're using to talk about teaching and learning, especially in relation to ableism and racism. And then, like I was saying, not just doing that as a or not just doing that as a value and not just doing that as a thought project, but then thinking very practically, how do we turn these into practices? How are our frameworks and meaning making showing up in practice? And if there's an incongruence or if there's a misalignment, how do we change that? How do we remain accountable to our families? How do we remain accountable to our students? And, I think of Mia Mingus and the way that she talks about accountability being, not accountability rooted in punishment, but accountability rooted in transformation. And I go think back to that all the time and reread her piece all the time. And so really moving away from behaviorism and talking and thinking and acting through a disability justice lens, knowing social and cultural and political histories and context, and actively working against the racism and ableism embedded in those in schools. Also being, and I spoke to this a little bit, also being honest with yourself and humble in the work and recognizing that there's always things to be learning and unlearning, right? That there's a lot of unlearning that we need to do too. And so, and as I've said many, many times, since it's what I absolutely love about and dream for in education is really that care and community and collective liberation. And that might have to happen outside of school walls, quite literally, but also figuratively. And then in this moment, really emphasizing and working through grassroots movements. And so educators, working with families, working with community organizers, I think is really needed to push us.
Well, it makes it alive instead of a destination or a training or a climate survey, and responsive to whoever's coming through the building at whatever time and how their needs show up. So I guess two-part final question is, your kids are just babies right now, but what do you hope that they'll understand about disability by the time they're school age? And then what's next for you?
I know, they're such little sweeties.
I have to meet them.
I know, you got to.
I'm being a bad disabled auntie elder.
You know, I very much so believe in sustainability. So we're all just, sustaining
I do love
ourselves
the cheers, so yeah, I'm here for that for you.
in every way possible. I really want, I want the beauty and creativity to be emphasized in disability. And simultaneously, I want the complexity. So, again, that there's no monolith, that there is beauty and there's lots of challenges. There's incredible community, and at times there's really a sense of isolation. And so allowing space for the complexity, so that kind of dual nature of celebration and complexity, and holding that space together. And we already read the book, We Move Together, which is incredible if folks haven't read it and they pick it out. But, and I think in We Move Together, one of the things that's amazing is that there's, understanding and, again, enactment, that moving together, the problem solving together, the creating together. I want so many things. My brain goes in so many different places when I think about what might be coming next. I actually am interested in doing more family engagement and family collaborations. So that's one of the areas. I also, of course, always want to be engaging and learning from disabled youths. I always say special ed is very problematic, and it's my absolute heart space. Maybe because there aren't at this point, many positive disabled spaces in schools. So, but I think there's a really, we can be transformative even in these really problematic structures that are set up. You have to have a little creativity, but I also really want to co-teach some of my teacher education courses with disabled youth.
That would be amazing.
That's been one of my dreams. Since I entered grad school, I was like, this is my goal. is having I have guest speakers. I show our 1 out of 5 videos, but I want a fully co-taught course. And so there's some logistics that would need to happen. So again, gotta get creative, but yeah. And then continuing the communications and collaborations and care alongside disabled organizations and partnering in teaching and research. All of it, really.
All the things. I'm just imagining little baby facilitators that you're, you've already birthed them, that you're just incubating over there in West Seattle. I love the idea of bringing more students into educator spaces. I'm really grateful to know you. Thanks for spending time with me today.
Yeah, like I said, you're what? I think it's Stacey Mulburn and Leah Lakshmi Piepsna Samarasina who talk about crip doulaing, and I feel like you were one of my major crip doulas.
I love being a crip doula. It's a lot of unpaid work, but
it is a lot of stuff.
we're kind of anti-capitalism in our community, but disabled people need money. It's stay tuned.
That's another one of the questions I highlight when I was talking to disabled activists, disability justice activists, and I was like, what do you think you'd want to see in schools? And they were anti-capitalist politic, and I was like, okay.
And get paid for it, though.
And get paid. Yeah, exactly.
We're anti-capitalist with pay.
But we also live in a capitalist society, so that balance. Anyway.
Thank you.
No, thank you.